What would you do if your employer refused to pay 12 years of wages and gave you a collapsing quarry house instead? 22-year-old surveyor's assistant Margaret Hale expected the ruined building to bury her beneath debt. Its roof leaked. Its western wall leaned toward the quarry, and the workers warned her never to strike the foundation stones. But Margaret's measurements revealed something impossible. The house stood 6 feet beyond the boundary, recorded in her employer's deed. When she removed a loose stone, she found a brass marker bearing the names of men killed in the quarry decades earlier. By nightfall, her former employer demanded the property back. Margaret soon realized the crumbling house did not conceal treasure. It concealed proof that an entire village had been stolen. The dispute began in the counting office of Whitcomb Stone Company on a bitter January morning in 1887. Margaret stood across from Silas Whitcomb, with 12 years of wage books stacked between them. Her father had worked as the company's surveyor until a tunnel collapse killed him. Margaret, then 10 years old and already able to hold a chain straight across rough ground, had continued his field notes for food and lodging. At 16, she began measuring quarry faces, calculating loads, and correcting boundary plans. Whitcomb called her an assistant whenever payment was discussed, and his surveyor whenever an error threatened his profits. Her father's contract promised that half his unpaid salary would support Margaret until adulthood. Her own wages, recorded in the company books but repeatedly deferred, brought the total debt to £186. Whitcomb pushed the ledgers aside. Your figures presume work no woman was authorized to perform. Margaret opened 3 plans bearing his signature beneath calculations in her hand. Then, these contracts were obtained using unauthorized surveys. His solicitor coughed. Whitcomb changed direction. The company lacked ready cash, he said, but would settle generously by conveying Quarry House and the half-acre surrounding it. The place had been abandoned since a rockfall cracked its western wall. It carried £6 in back taxes and stood beside the exhausted north pit. Everyone in Bellwether knew it was worth less than a year of Margaret's wages. Whitcomb expected her to refuse. Refusal would allow him to call the debt disputed and delay her for years. Margaret accepted. Laughter traveled from the clerks' desks outside. Whitcomb made her sign a receipt stating that the property represented full settlement. She added the words, "subject to accurate boundary verification," before placing her name beneath his. The solicitor noticed. Whitcomb did not. Margaret packed her father's brass compass, 2 chains, a plane table, a plumb bob, and every field notebook she had legally inherited. By afternoon, she was walking north along the quarry road. Bellwether crouched beneath gray cliffs, stone dust whitened roofs, hedges, faces, and even the winter stream. The profitable south quarry rang with hammers. The north pit lay silent behind a fence bearing Whitcomb's warning signs. Quarry House stood between them, built of massive limestone blocks under a broken slate roof. Its western wall leaned 3 inches from true. One chimney had fallen through the upper floor, and rain had turned the kitchen into a shallow pond. A widow named Ellen Shaw watched Margaret unlock the door. Ellen's husband had lost a leg in Whitcomb's quarry and now sharpened tools at home. "Do not touch the foundation," she warned. Men who tried regretted it. Margaret asked whether the house was believed cursed. Ellen said curses were explanations rich owners encouraged when they did not want poor people looking closely. 31 years earlier, 9 quarrymen died when the north face collapsed. Afterward, their families claimed the workers had purchased shares in the land through deductions from wages. Whitcomb's father denied the claim. Quarry House, then used as the crew office, was locked. 2 widows who tried to enter were arrested for trespass. Within 5 years, most families left Bellwether. Margaret's father had never mentioned the dispute, but his earliest surviving notebook began 1 month after the collapse. Several pages had been removed. She spent her first night in the dry corner beneath the stairs. Wind entered through the roof. Rats moved inside the walls, and each distant blast from the south pit shook grit from the ceiling. At dawn, she surveyed the house. Whitcomb's deed described a rectangular half-acre aligned with the north road, yet the house's long axis did not match the road or the quarry grid. It aligned with an older church tower 2 miles east. Margaret established a baseline, measured each wall, and compared the bearings with the deed. The western foundation stood 6 feet beyond Whitcomb's boundary. More strangely, The deed's eastern line passed through the middle of the kitchen. Either half the house belonged to someone else, or the plan had been drawn around the building after construction. Under the leaning wall, mortar differed at 1 block. Margaret scraped away moss and found a narrow slot. She refused to strike it. Instead, she built a timber support, eased pressure with a screwjack borrowed from Mr. Shaw, and removed crumbled mortar by hand. The block slid forward enough to reveal a brass plate set into its inner face. 9 names had been engraved around a central symbol of crossed hammers. Below them were the words North Bellwether Workers Association. Lot 1 of 12. This was not a memorial placed after death. The plate marked property. Margaret copied it by rubbing and returned the stone exactly. That evening, Whitcomb arrived with 2 quarry guards. News traveled quickly in a village where half the households depended on him. He said a clerical mistake had placed Quarry House in the settlement. He offered Margaret £10 to surrender the deed. Yesterday it settled a debt of 186. She replied, "Today it is worth 10. Today I am being kind." His eyes moved to the fresh timber bracing. He knew she had examined the foundation. When she refused, he warned that the west wall might collapse without notice. Margaret showed him her plumb measurements, proving the lean had remained stable, since a mark her father made 7 years earlier. Whitcomb's expression revealed that he recognized the mark. He had sent her father to inspect this house while telling everyone it was unsafe to enter. After Whitcomb left, Margaret opened that year's notebook. Her father's daily entries recorded weather, quarry output, and small payments. On the date beside the wall mark, he wrote only S.W. Insists old line governs. Asked me to set new pegs after dark. Refused. 2 weeks later, he died in the tunnel collapse. The official account said a support failed. Margaret had always accepted it. Now she examined his final plan. The tunnel where he died lay nowhere near the scheduled survey route. Someone had sent him there. Suspicion was not proof, and grief could make patterns where none existed. She forced herself back to measurable facts. The brass marker named 9 men. Parish burial records confirmed all died in the North collapse. Rate books listed Quarry House not under Whitcomb Stone but under Bellwether Association rooms until the year after the disaster. Then the entry vanished. Margaret searched the company wage books she had copied during the dispute. For each named man, 6 pence per week had been deducted under the initials B, L, F. The company called it a burial and loss fund. Over 14 years, the deductions amounted to enough to purchase land. Ellen Shaw introduced Margaret to the oldest surviving quarryman, Amos Pike. At 78, Amos could no longer straighten his back, but he remembered the association. The workers believed B, L, F meant Bellwether Land Fund. Whitcomb's father promised that when 12 lots were paid, every contributing family would receive a cottage share, garden ground, and joint mineral rights in the north face. Quarry House stored their books. After the collapse, company men removed every document. Amos had helped set brass markers into 12 foundations, so deeds could be reconstructed if papers were lost. Why did nobody use them? Margaret asked. Amos looked toward the quarry. One widow showed a marker to the magistrate. The next week her cottage burned. Another family's son lost his job. Fear scattered the rest. Amos knew the approximate lots, but not every boundary. Margaret spent the following week making Quarry House habitable. While surveying by daylight, she patched one roof section with used slate, cleared the chimney, and drained the kitchen through an old stone channel. Ellen brought soup. Mr. Shaw repaired her jack. 2 boys carried rubble for pennies. Whitcomb retaliated quietly. The general shop refused credit. The blacksmith said company orders occupied him. A tax collector demanded immediate payment. Margaret sold her mother's silver thimble and paid the £6, removing the easiest path to seizure. She then offered practical surveying services to small farmers. Her first client wanted a disputed hedge measured. Her result favored the neighbor by 2 feet, costing her the client's goodwill, but earning the neighbor's trust. Within days, she had 3 honest commissions. At Quarry House, anomalies multiplied. The kitchen drain aligned with a buried groove running toward the north pit. Iron rings remained in the cellar floor at equal intervals. Door lintels carried tiny chisel marks resembling compass points. When Margaret plotted them, The marks formed bearings radiating from Quarry House toward 11 other village structures, cottages, a chapelle store, a ruined way station, and an old communelone. Quarry House was the reference station for all 12 lots. Whitcomb's deed did not merely shrink one property. It erased a coordinated plan. Margaret and Amos visited the nearest marked cottage after dark. Its tenant, a Whitcomb foreman named Caleb Rusk, refused entry and reported them. The next morning, Whitcomb posted notices forbidding Margaret from crossing company land because roads to several lots passed through his current parcel. Investigation became harder. Margaret worked from public lanes, church ground, and invited gardens. She used the church tower as a fixed point and reconstructed old bearings through triangulation. Children held ranging rods while their parents watched. At the fourth lot, beneath a bakery threshold, they found another brass marker. It bore 3 different names and the words Lot 4 of 12. One named woman, Sarah Pike, had contributed after her husband's death. The association had allowed widows to retain shares, an unusually protective rule for the time. The discovery turned rumor into a pattern. Whitcomb called a village meeting and accused Margaret of disturbing foundations, inventing claims, and threatening every tenant with eviction. He framed himself as protector. If her theory succeeded, he said, confused ownership would halt the quarry and destroy wages. Fear moved through the room. Margaret did not promise that no disruption would occur. She explained that ownership and operation were different questions. Work could continue under leases or cooperative management if legitimate owners agreed. A man shouted that such arrangements existed only in pamphlets. Amos stood and said the association had operated exactly that way before Whitcomb's father destroyed it. Caleb Rusk asked whether Margaret intended to own the entire quarry herself. She answered that the markers did not carry her name. That distinction gained more trust than a stirring speech would have. Whitcomb then produced a deed dated 2 weeks before the North collapse. It showed the association sold all 12 lots and mineral rights to his father for settlement of equipment debts. 3 worker representatives had signed, including Margaret's father as witness. The room went silent. Margaret was 4 years old on the deed's date. Her father's signature looked genuine. Whitcomb offered to let her inspect it. She measured letter spacing, ink spread, and paper dimensions. Nothing obvious proved forgery. The deed could end every claim. Yet the survey plan attached to it used the grid established after the collapse. Margaret recognized her father's notation system, but one bearing referenced the South Quarry chimney built 6 years later. A document dated 1856 could not have used a landmark from 1862. She pointed this out publicly. Whitcomb's solicitor said the plan had been recopied later for clarity. Then it is not the original attachment. Margaret replied, "Where is that?" Whitcomb ended the meeting. That night, someone entered Quarry House while Margaret slept. She woke to the sound of stone grinding below. A lantern moved through the kitchen. Rather than confront the intruder, she slipped through the broken pantry wall and circled outside. 2 men were levering at the western foundation. Their blows threatened the brass plate and the already leaning wall. Margaret rang the old association bell hanging beside the door. Its iron voice carried across bellwether. Windows opened. The men fled. One left a wedge-stamped W. S. C. Villagers arrived in time to see company tools and fresh damage. Even those unsure of Margaret's claim understood that Whitcomb wanted the foundation destroyed. The wall had shifted another half-inch. Saving it required more timber than Margaret could afford. At dawn, families brought beams from sheds and abandoned cottages. Mr. Shaw directed bracing from his chair, while Amos checked each support. They did not act because ownership was proven. They acted because evidence deserved to survive. Behind the loosened foundation block, Margaret found a narrow cavity containing a lead tube. Inside was a linen plan, dry but stained at the edges. It showed all 12 lots. The North Quarry, shared roads, water rights, and a reserve fund parcel. Each lot was assigned fractions in the mineral face, according to total contributions. At the bottom appeared the association seal and 9 signatures. It was a working plan, not a registered deed. More important was a notation in her father's hand, original instruments deposited with Harbury Mutual Bank. Box held jointly. Duplicate key at reference house. Her father had learned the truth. He marked the location of the key with a small triangle beneath Quarry House. Margaret searched every triangular feature and found nothing until she considered the surveyor's meaning. A reference triangle was not a shape on a wall, but 3 fixed points defining one position. Bearings from the church tower. Communal Oven and North Gate intersected at the dry well behind the house. 15 feet down, behind a loose lining stone, Thomas Hale had hidden a brass key wrapped in waxed cloth. Harbury lay 40 miles away. Margaret sent no letter because Whitcomb controlled the post carrier's quarry contract. She traveled before dawn with Ellen, carrying the key, Linenplan, wage deductions, and marker rubbings. At the bank, the manager located a dormant association box. Its register showed annual fees paid from the Bellwether Reserve Fund until 1861. Then one final payment by Thomas Hale in 1879. Whitcomb's father had tried to claim the box twice, but lacked both keys. Bank rules required a court order or one association key, plus proof from 3 listed family lines. Margaret had the key but represented none of the 9 dead workers. Ellen descended from one contributor through her mother. Amos represented another. A 3rd surviving family had to be found before the box could open. The register listed names and last known addresses, but one page had been cut away. As Margaret and Ellen left the bank, Caleb Rusk waited across the street. Whitcomb had followed them after all. Caleb did not approach. He watched them board the coach, then rode ahead. By the time Margaret returned to Bellwether, Whitcomb had petitioned the county court to declare the bank box company property. His forged deed, if accepted, would give him standing. He also dismissed Ellen's husband from tool work and ordered Amos out of the cottage his family had rented for 50 years. Margaret had expected legal pressure against herself. Punishment directed at her witnesses was harder to bear. Ellen refused to retreat. Mr. Shaw moved his grinding wheel into Quarry House and continued working for independent masons. Amos accepted a bed beside the stove and joked that Whitcomb had finally returned one association member to its reference house. The 3rd family line belonged to Jacob Lyle, listed in the parish register as emigrated to Canada. His only recorded daughter died unmarried. The trail appeared closed until Margaret examined the brass marker again. One engraved name was Mary Lyle, not Jacob. Association contributions continued under her name for 18 months after his emigration. Mary had been his sister, a laundress who married under the name Dane. Lucy Dane's grandmother, now living at the southern edge of Bellwether, was Mary's daughter. Whitcomb's clerk reached Mrs. Dane first and offered £50 for any association rights. She was 74, nearly blind, and dependent on a grandson employed at the South Quarry. £50 could change her final years. Margaret refused to pressure her. She explained that opening the box might recover land, but might also provoke litigation, job losses, and delay. Mrs. Dane asked who would own the quarry if the documents were genuine. Those named by the rules inside the documents. Margaret said, "Not me, unless they grant something for my work." The old woman laughed. Whitcomb's clerk had promised that Margaret intended to seize every cottage. Mrs. Dane signed a statement of lineage and placed her thumbprint beside it. She did not reject Whitcomb's money from loyalty to strangers. She rejected it because he demanded silence before showing what he feared. The bank scheduled the opening under supervision. Whitcomb obtained an emergency order delaying it, claiming the key had been stolen by Thomas Hale. Margaret countered with her father's notebook and the $1,879 fee entry. The judge allowed the box to open, but required all contents inventoried without removal. Inside were the association charter, contribution books, 12 executed trust deeds, mineral leases, correspondence, and a sealed packet labeled, "In event of death or unlawful dissolution." The charter appointed Harbury Mutual as custodian and declared that no sale of land or mineral rights was valid without approval from 2/3 of contributing households, including widows who inherited shares. Whitcomb's deed carried only 3 signatures. Even if genuine, it could not convey the whole property. The trust deeds showed that the association, not Whitcomb Stone, had purchased the North Quarry and 12 lots. The sealed packet contained minutes from a meeting 4 days before the collapse. Edmund Whitcomb demanded repayment of machinery loans that the contribution book showed already paid. The association refused. The men then voted to suspend blasting after Thomas Hale identified a dangerous fracture above the north face. Edmund ordered work to continue. 9 men entered because dismissal would forfeit their cottage shares under a company rule that contradicted the association charter. The face collapsed the next morning. The packet also contained a statement from the blasting foreman, admitting Edmund instructed him to double the powder charge to reach a deeper seam. The foreman intended to testify, but he vanished before the inquest. The final item was a survey by Margaret's father, completed in 1879. It proved Whitcomb Stone had been removing valuable limestone across the north boundary for at least 15 years. Thomas estimated unpaid royalties sufficient to restore the workers' reserve fund. He wrote that he had confronted Silas Whitcomb and would meet him inside Tunnel 7 to inspect boundary pegs. Tunnel 7 was where Thomas died. Margaret's grief became a cold, measured thing. The box did not prove Silas murdered him. It proved Silas arranged the meeting and later concealed its purpose. The company report claimed Thomas entered alone by mistake. Margaret requested the original accident log. Whitcomb said it had been destroyed by damp. A former lamp boy named Peter Cole came forward after hearing about the bank box. He had seen Silas and Thomas enter Tunnel 7 together. Silas emerged 10 minutes before the collapse and ordered Peter to say Thomas was alone. Peter remained silent because his mother and 5 siblings lived in a company cottage. He had carried that shame for 8 years. Margaret did not offer easy absolution. She asked him to sign a sworn account and accept cross-examination. He did. News of the documents spread beyond Bellwether. Quarry owners feared that recognizing the association would encourage claims elsewhere. Labor societies offered support but tried to turn Margaret into a symbol before the boundaries were settled. She refused speeches in cities while Quarry House still depended on braces. Her task was not to become famous. It was to make the evidence usable. She created a continuity map connecting each lot marker, deed, contribution line, heir, and current occupant. Where records conflicted, she marked uncertainty rather than choosing the answer she preferred. Miriam Dane held a share but rented outside the 12 lots. Caleb Rusk occupied Lot 3 without ancestral claim. The bakery family had bought its building in good faith from Whitcomb. Justice could not mean throwing them all out. Margaret proposed that valid heirs receive association shares rather than immediate possession, while current householders could obtain secure leases or purchase occupancy rights at modest rates. Mineral royalties would fund compensation, repairs, and community services. Amos said the original association intended cottages for workers, not a new class of absentee heirs. They revised the plan so active workers and resident households also earned shares over time. Debate lasted nights. Some descendants wanted land sold and money divided. Some current tenants denied old claim. The disagreement proved the association was real, not a convenient crowd united around Margaret. Whitcomb exploited every division. He offered private settlements to heirs, threatened tenants, and announced the South Quarry would close unless his title remained untouched. Families who had supported Margaret began avoiding her. One stone struck the quarry house window. A note beneath it read, "Surveys do not feed children." Margaret understood the fear. She published company accounts obtained through the litigation, showing the South Quarry remained profitable. Closure was a choice, not an economic necessity. Whitcomb closed it anyway. 300 men lost wages. Bellwether's shops emptied within a week. Anger turned toward Margaret. Even Thomas's innocence mattered little beside hungry households. She had prepared for a legal fight, not the moral burden of an entire village's income. Selling Quarry House to Whitcomb could reopen work immediately. He sent an agreement offering £500 and guaranteed employment if all association claims were withdrawn. Margaret placed it before the families. She would not make the choice alone. At the meeting, a mother asked whether principals would buy bread. Margaret answered no. Then she opened her own accounts. Cedric Ward, an independent builder for whom she had surveyed farms, agreed to purchase cut stone from the north stockpiles if lawful temporary access could be arranged. The association box contained an emergency clause, allowing 3 family lines to appoint a provisional committee when operations ceased. Ellen, Amos, and Mrs. Dane appointed 5 members, including 2 current quarrymen and Margaret as surveyor without voting control. They leased the safe eastern bench of the North Pit to a worker crew for 8 weeks. Initial stone sales would be small. A labor relief fund offered tools and food credit. It was not enough to replace 300 wages, but it could employ 40 men and demonstrate an alternative. Whitcomb obtained an injunction, alleging trespass. Margaret showed that his own deed excluded the 6-foot strip around Quarry House. While the trust deed connected that strip by road easement to the north bench, the judge allowed limited work pending trial under an independent safety inspector. Whitcomb had counted on desperation, ending resistance before law caught up. The first cooperative shift entered the North Quarry. Under Margaret's measured plan, she marked exclusion zones beneath unstable faces, limited powder charges, and required every crack logged before and after blasting. Some men mocked rules written by a 22-year-old woman. When an experienced cutter ignored a red line, Margaret dismissed him for the day. The crew threatened to walk out. At noon, a slab broke exactly where her measurements predicted and crushed the empty space he would have occupied. No one crossed another red line. The first load sold for £14. After costs, each worker received less than a normal Whitcomb wage, but he received it from books he could inspect. More crews applied. The chapel organized meals. Women repaired sacks and managed orders for pay rather than charity. Mr. Shaw sharpened tools in the Quarry House kitchen. Amos sat by the door checking names against contribution records. The ruined house became an office again. Whitcomb escalated. Someone moved Margaret's boundary stakes during the night. She had anticipated it and recorded bearings to permanent church and bedrock points. The altered stakes became evidence of interference. Then blasting powder disappeared from the cooperative store and was found beneath Quarry House. Whitcomb accused Margaret of unsafe storage. The powder kegs carried company inventory brands, and their mud matched the South Quarry Road. Constable Bell seized them and posted a guard. Caleb Rusk unexpectedly provided the next piece. As Whitcomb's foreman, he had followed Margaret to Harbury and participated in pressure against witnesses. He believed loyalty would protect his position. When Whitcomb closed the South Quarry, Caleb was dismissed with everyone else. He brought Margaret a bundle of copied instructions ordering stake removal, powder placement, and surveillance. In exchange, he wanted immunity from association claims against him. Margaret could not grant it. She promised only that his cooperation would be recorded and that the provisional plan protected good faith occupants. Caleb signed anyway. His papers linked Whitcomb directly to sabotage, but not to Thomas Hale's death. The truth about Tunnel 7 lay in geometry. Margaret revisited the collapsed entrance with Peter Cole. Company plans showed one route, but airflow through a crack suggested a second passage. Thomas's last notebook recorded a bearing from the church tower to a peg inside the tunnel. If Margaret extended it, the line met the disputed north boundary beneath a narrow ventilation shaft. Silas had not invited Thomas there merely to argue. Thomas had found underground proof that the company crossed into Association Stone. The collapse buried it. Reopening the tunnel was expensive and dangerous. Whitcomb offered to fund the work under his engineers. No one trusted him. The cooperative allocated half its first month's surplus, and an independent mining inspector designed a slow clearing operation. It took 7 weeks to advance 80 feet. Every timber cost money families needed for food. Doubt returned. Then workers uncovered Thomas Hale's brass transit crushed beneath a roof stone. Beyond it stood 2 boundary pegs. One bore the association hammer seal. The other, placed 4 feet deeper into association land, bore Whitcomb Stone's mark. Chisel scratches showed someone had attempted to remove the first. In a dry niche, Margaret found her father's oilskin field packet. It contained measured sections of unauthorized extraction, and a short note, Silas offers payment for silence. Refused. If accidental cure, compare powder issue with shift book. The powder issue ledger in the bank box showed Tunnel 7 received 6 kegs on the day Thomas died. The shift book reported only 2 used. Caleb produced warehouse copies showing Silas personally signed for the remaining 4. Whether he intended murder or reckless intimidation would be decided by a jury. But concealment was no longer disputable. Whitcomb fled Bellwether the night before the title trial. He took company cash and attempted to board a ship at Liverpool. Police detained him under the sabotage warrant. His flight did not automatically prove every accusation, but it ended his performance as the village's responsible protector. The title case proceeded against the company and creditors. Margaret testified for 2 days. Whitcomb's barrister tried to portray her as a rejected employee motivated by unpaid wages. She agreed that she had been unpaid and rejected. Those facts explained why she held Quarry House, not why 12 markers matched 12 trust deeds. He asked whether her reconstruction depended on her father's notes. She said no, and removed each item that did bank register, association charter, executed deeds, contribution book, parish rates, physical markers, independent bearings, and quarry extraction records. The claim remained. Her father's papers added knowledge of fraud but did not create ownership. That distinction protected the case. The court recognized the Bellwether Land and Mineral Trust as never lawfully dissolved. Whitcombstone's title to the North Quarry in 12 lots was voided because decades of later leases and purchases involved innocent parties. The judge ordered a supervised settlement rather than immediate eviction. The trust received the North mineral rights, Quarry House, Reserve Parcelle, and compensation for proven unauthorized extraction within statutory limits. Current residents received secure occupancy, verified heirs, active workers, and resident households gained shares under a revised charter approved by the court. The South Quarry remained company property but entered insolvency after Whitcomb's arrest. The trust purchased essential equipment at auction using compensation and cooperative subscriptions. Silas Whitcomb was later convicted of fraud, evidence tampering, conspiracy to sabotage, and causing the Tunnel 7 collapse through unlawful powder placement. The jury could not establish that he intended Thomas Hale's death, so he was not convicted of murder. Margaret accepted the distinction. Justice became weaker when it claimed certainty evidence did not support. He served a long prison term, lost the company, and was ordered to repay what assets remained. Edmund Whitcomb had died years earlier, but the official inquiry corrected the North collapse, finding unsafe blasting, ordered by management, caused the deaths, and the workers were not trespassers but joint owners. The ruling did not make Bellwether prosperous. The cooperative inherited a quarry with unstable faces, worn equipment, disputed accounts, and workers who had spent years taking orders rather than sharing decisions. The first elected committee nearly broke apart over wages. Older cutters wanted seniority rates. Younger laborers argued that risk was shared. Widows holding inherited shares asked why dividends should wait while machinery was purchased. Margaret refused permanent authority and accepted a one-year appointment as surveyor and safety officer. Her salary was posted beside every other wage. The committee adopted a base rate, skill additions, injury coverage, and a repair reserve. Nobody received everything demanded. Everyone could see why. Quarry House required equally patient work. Engineers said the western wall could be saved if its foundation was underpinned in short sections. Rebuilding it entirely would destroy the original markers. Margaret designed supports around each brass plate, one section at a time. Masons excavated, poured lime concrete, reset stone, and recorded every object. All 12 markers were eventually found. The missing lots had not disappeared. They survived beneath a chapel step, a smithy wall, the communal oven, 2 cottages, the way station, and edges of the North Quarry Road. Each was left visible behind a small iron door. Children could open them and read the names. The recovered compensation first funded necessities, a safe powder store away from homes, drainage, new ropes, and a rescue cart. Some shareholders demanded a grand association hall. Amos argued that a trust proving ownership through a broken house should not waste money pretending it had never been poor. Quarry House became the hall, office, survey school, and tool room. Its roof was repaired in stages. The leaning wall remained slightly out of square, stabilized but honest. Margaret kept the first timber brace mounted inside, as a reminder that neighbors protected evidence before courts recognized it. The cooperative's hardest year began when a national building slowdown reduced stone orders. The old company would have cut wages and continued extraction until stockpiles grew. The committee instead reduced shifts, used reserve funds, and trained crews to cut finished architectural pieces worth more than rough blocks. Margaret surveyed abandoned clay beds on trust land and found material suitable for lime-poor bricks. But development required capital, rather than mortgage mineral rights to one banker. Households purchased small bonds redeemable over 10 years. Returns were modest. Control remained local. The brick works employed workers unable to manage quarry lifting. including Mr. Shaw. Ellen organized a canteen that became profitable enough to stand as its own cooperative. None of these ventures appeared magically. Kiln temperatures failed. The first bricks cracked, and one bond payment was delayed by 6 weeks. Accounts recorded the failure and correction. Trust grew because bad news appeared beside good. Margaret continued investigating her father's death even after the conviction. She wanted to understand why he waited 8 years after discovering the old wall mark before securing the bank key. His notebook showed the answer slowly. Thomas Hale had once accepted Whitcomb's explanation that the association debts justified takeover. He set 2 replacement pegs early in his employment before contribution records changed his mind. Shame made him cautious. He feared admitting his own role would weaken every claim. In his final years, he copied records, paid the bank fee, and planned to testify only when evidence no longer depended on his character. Margaret had built an image of him as a perfect man wronged by villains. The notebooks revealed a better truth: he had participated through ignorance, recognized the wrong, and worked to repair it at personal risk. At a trust meeting, she read both his confession and his final note. Some families were angry. One descendant said Thomas's early pegs enabled years of extraction. Margaret agreed and proposed that the survey school bear no individual's name. The community accepted his evidence without turning him into a saint. Peter Cole struggled after testifying. Men called him coward for 8 silent years, while others treated him as a hero. Both judgments flattened. The life fear had forced upon him. The trust employed him as lamp inspector, only after ordinary qualification. He later spoke to apprentices about reporting unsafe orders, always beginning with the cost of his own delay. Caleb Rusk remained in Lot 3 under a secure lease. He lost his foreman's authority and worked as a cutter. Several families wanted him expelled for spying. The charter's protections for good faith occupants prevented retaliation. Over time, he repaid trust through unremarkable reliability rather than dramatic redemption. He maintained boundary doors, never missed a rent payment, and testified whenever Whitcomb's creditors challenged the settlement. Mrs. Dane used her first dividend to replace her leaking roof and buy spectacles. When asked whether she regretted refusing Whitcomb's £50, she said her share had not made her rich, but it allowed her granddaughter to live without asking permission from the man who employed her brother. Amos died 2 winters after the ruling. He spent his final afternoon in Quarry House, watching apprentices copy the 12-lot plan. In his will, he left his share to the trust's injury fund rather than distant relatives who had never lived in Bellwether. His chair remained by the association bell, not as a relic no one could touch, but as the seat used by whoever kept the day's visitor record. Margaret's personal settlement presented another question. The court recognized that Whitcomb's conveyance of Quarry House had settled her wage claim, yet the restored trust owned the land beneath it. She could demand compensation or claim a private life interest. Instead, the trust paid her unpaid wages from recovered royalties over 5 years, and she reconveyed the house, retaining a small room and workshop for as long as she served. She bought a separate cottage with her earnings. Ownership mattered to her, but she refused to base security on land whose recovery belonged to many families. Her cottage stood above the dust line and had a window facing the quarry. She planted hawthorn along its boundary, using measurements no one disputed. Suitors appeared after newspapers made her famous. One London engineer praised her courage while suggesting he could manage the cooperative more efficiently. She declined before dessert. Affection, if it came, would not arrive disguised as supervision. Thomas Reed, a young stone carver unrelated to the Reed family of Brackenford, became her closest companion through years of shared work. He did not rescue her from loneliness or assume authority over her maps. He argued about tool budgets, made tea badly, and carved the workers' names without enlarging his own signature. They married quietly in the repaired kitchen of Quarry House. Margaret kept the name Hale in her professional work, and Thomas saw no injury in that. Their partnership remained one strand of her life, not its reward. Marriage did not remove the work that waited each morning. 3 weeks after the ceremony, a creditor of Whitcomb Stone challenged the trust's right to purchase quarry machinery at auction. The creditor claimed the compensation award had been calculated using inflated extraction surveys prepared by Margaret herself. If the challenge succeeded, the trust could lose its hoists, carts, and cutting sheds at the start of the busiest season. Margaret could not serve as both disputed expert and principal defender. She turned over every field book to an independent surveyor selected jointly by the court and creditor. For 16 days she entered the quarry without carrying her own plane table. An absence that felt like walking without balance. The independent survey found that Margaret's estimate was not inflated. It was low. One buried extraction gallery extended 90 feet farther beneath trust land than the accessible records showed. The creditor withdrew its challenge after the trust agreed to purchase 2 disputed carts at market value. Some shareholders accused Margaret of compromising when complete victory was possible. She explained that litigation would cost more than the carts and delay contracts. Justice required judgment about resources, not merely certainty about being right. The committee approved the settlement by 1 vote. That narrow margin mattered. The trust had not become Margaret's instrument. The following summer brought a different test. A hotel company offered a 5-year contract for pale limestone, enough to double wages and complete the school without additional bonds. The requested stone came from the western face above an old water fissure. Margaret's measurements showed extraction was possible only if monthly output remained below the hotel's demand. The buyer offered a bonus if she revised the safety limit. He argued that Whitcomb had cut the same face for years. Whitcomb also buried 9 owners and called it an accident. Ellen said, "The committee rejected the contract. For months the decision looked foolish. A rival quarry won the work. Bellwether school construction slowed, and 2 families moved away for steadier wages. Then the rival western face failed after prolonged rain, destroying equipment and injuring 7 men. Bellwether workers did not congratulate themselves. They raised money for the injured families and sent copies of their Fisher monitoring method. Safety used as superiority would become another form of power. The failed hotel contract led Margaret to study uses for smaller blocks, the quarry already discarded. Thomas developed interlocking drainage stones cut from irregular pieces. Lillian experimented with thin slate-backed panels. Mr. Shaw designed a hand clamp allowing workers with 1 strong leg or limited grip to hold carving tools safely. Their products earned less fame than monumental stone, but produced steady orders from farms, rail platforms, and town drains. Waste piles shrank. Profits came from attention rather than faster extraction. The revised charter required every technical improvement to name its maker. When a manufacturer offered to patent Mr. Shaw's clamp in exchange for a lump sum, he chose a modest licensing plan that allowed injured workers to make it without fees. His name appeared on each commercial model. For the first time in his life, an object traveled beyond Bellwether, carrying proof that his mind, not only his damaged body, had value. The trust archive also revealed obligations no one anticipated. The original association had promised a small pension to families of men killed in joint work. Those payments ended after the North collapse. Descendants argued that arrears should now be paid across 30 years. Lawyers said the old promise was probably unenforceable. Mrs. Reed, visiting from Brackenford to compare cooperative accounts, asked a simpler question. Had the association intended protection to end when management stole its books? The Bellwether Committee created a memorial settlement for surviving widows and dependent children, funded over 10 years, so current wages would not collapse. It could not repay every missed shilling. It acknowledged the debt in the same public books that recorded repayment. One beneficiary was a woman who had testified for Whitcomb at the original inquest because he threatened to evict her children. Some descendants objected. Margaret defended her inclusion. A protection fund that excluded frightened people for having been frightened would reward the exact coercion Whitcomb used. The decision passed after bitter debate. It remained controversial. Yet the woman's granddaughter later became the school's first full-time teacher. Not every conflict involved the past. Young workers who entered after the ruling had not endured the title fight and cared less about annual marker walks. They saw the trust rules as slow. A group proposed selling mineral rights to a railway syndicate in exchange for modern machinery and immediate shares worth nearly £100 per household. The offer was legal and far more generous than Whitcomb's private bargain. Margaret refused to campaign against it. She surveyed the proposed extraction zones, calculated reserves, and presented the numbers. The syndicate's production schedule would exhaust accessible high-grade stone in 12 years, employ more men for 6, then sharply reduce labor. Its contract transferred water rights and allowed the company to move households near future pits. The £100 was real. So was the loss of long-term control. Every adult resident and verified heir received a vote under the charter. For weeks, Bellwether divided into camps. Thomas favored rejection but accused Margaret of making technical language too difficult. She rewrote the report using household examples: how many winter coal bills one payment covered, how many years each job lasted, what rent families might pay if relocated. The syndicate complained she was biased. She offered its agents equal space to explain their plan publicly. The final vote rejected the sale by only 11 ballots. Margaret felt relief, then noticed nearly half the community had voted yes. She proposed no celebration. The committee instead created a development account, giving households smaller annual capital distributions when reserves allowed. People had been tempted not because they lacked virtue but because long-term ownership did not eliminate present need. The railways still became a customer, purchasing cut stone without owning the land beneath it. A branch line reached Bellwether 2 years later, under an easement that returned to the trust if unused. Margaret marked its boundaries herself with 4 permanent stones and duplicate maps. The first train carried stone outward and library books inward. Miriam Dane, younger than her grandmother and determined to learn accounts, organized a reading room in the old way station. Evening classes taught contracts as carefully as arithmetic. Residents who could read every word of a deed were harder to dispossess through elegant language. One winter, scarlet fever closed the school and filled cottages with illness. Quarry production stopped voluntarily to prevent crews carrying infection between households. The reserve paid half wages for 3 weeks. Critics said a stone trust had no business funding health. The charter's purpose, Ellen answered, was not stone. Stone was the shared asset through which households secured life. The association hired a nurse and converted Quarry House's upper room into a temporary ward. No hidden medical legacy waited in its walls. The value came from a roof repaired before crisis, an account strong enough to suspend profit. 12 people fell seriously ill. All survived. When work resumed, the committee added a permanent sickness fund. Margaret's survey school expanded during quiet seasons. Students learned field geometry, map lettering, geology, and law of evidence. She required them to survey the same garden from different baselines, compare errors, and explain why disagreement occurred. One gifted student, Owen Marsh, produced flawless drawings but altered inconvenient measurements, so closures balanced. Under Whitcomb, such skill might have earned promotion. Margaret failed him. Owen accused her of destroying his future over fractions. She showed him the false deed whose bearings referenced a chimney built 6 years too late. Fractions become houses when someone owns the pencil, she said. Owen repeated the term honestly and later became the trust's records clerk. Years afterward, he discovered a copying error in Margaret's own map that assigned a narrow drainage strip to the wrong lot. Correcting it reduced her cottage garden by 18 inches. She moved the fence herself. The village watched because principles gain weight when they inconvenience the person teaching them. The Bellwether model drew visitors from other industrial towns. Some arrived hoping for a simple recipe: find old deeds. Expose vilain. Form cooperative. Prosper. Margaret disappointed them. She described the months of hunger, legal costs, disagreements, failed bricks, narrow votes, and limits of compensation. Shared ownership did not make people uniformly wise or generous. It gave them standing, information, and procedures through which conflict did not automatically end in obedience to the richest person. Several communities adapted parts of the charter. Others decided different arrangements suited them. Bellwether charged no fee for copies, but requested that improvements be returned to the archive. A Welsh slate group contributed a better injury schedule. A Northern Mill Association shared rules preventing committees from hiring relatives without open review. The charter became stronger because it traveled. Whitcomb wrote to Margaret once from prison. He claimed his father built Bellwether, that workers would have starved without company risk, and that Margaret's cooperative survived only by using roads, markets, and skills his family created. She almost burned the letter. Instead, she placed it in the archive beside wage deductions and accident logs. Power rarely understands itself as theft. Whitcomb's claim contained one partial truth. The company had organized capital and markets. The wrong was not that management contributed nothing. The wrong was using its contribution to erase everyone else's. Students read the letter and argued with it using accounts rather than inherited hatred. Silas died before completing his sentence. No public monument marked him. His children changed their... The trust did not pursue them for debts beyond assets transferred from the company. Responsibility could be inherited through property and benefit, not blood alone. This principle mattered to Margaret because she had refused to make Cedric Ward answer for every choice of his employers and refused to make current tenants pay for Whitcomb's forged title. Bellwether's justice aimed to repair chains, not create new ones. Time altered Quarry House. The kitchen where rain once pooled became a records room with slate shelves raised above flood level. Mr. Shaw's grinding wheel remained near the window until his death, after which apprentices restored it and continued using it. Amos's chair acquired new arms twice. The upper room served as ward, classroom, and visiting surveyor's lodging. Margaret's small first-night corner beneath the stairs remained unplastered. She had scratched her initial baseline calculation into the wall there. Students often asked why the trust preserved such an ordinary mark when brass plates existed below. Margaret told them the calculation was wrong by 3/4 of an inch because she had measured while cold and exhausted. She kept it to show that a useful investigation could begin with imperfect work, provided errors were corrected instead of defended. Ellen Shaw served 3 terms as committee chair. She possessed no formal education beyond village school, yet could identify a misleading expense report faster than any solicitor. On a rule, meetings ended at a fixed hour, so women responsible for evening care could participate without punishment. She required speakers to declare financial interests before debate. These changes sounded small beside title judgments, but they determined whose voices survived. Once excitement faded, when Ellen retired, the committee elected Caleb Rusk's daughter Jane, who had begun as a stone sorter. Some older association families objected because Caleb once spied for Whitcomb. Jane answered that the charter assigned standing by current work and residence, not inherited innocence. She won by secret ballot. Her leadership completed no sentimental forgiveness. It proved the trust no longer needed permanent enemies to remember its history. Margaret and Thomas had one daughter, Ruth, named not for a perfect ancestor, but for Margaret's mother, who had sewn the first cloth bags around survey instruments. Ruth grew up treating brass markers as common objects rather than miracles. At 14, she announced that she preferred botany to surveying. Margaret felt an unreasonable sting, then recognized the old desire to make a child continue unfinished work. She helped Ruth apprentice with a horticulturist. Years later, Ruth returned to map soil on the common gardens, combining her skill with the trust's records in a way Margaret could never have planned. Legacy remained alive by changing hands, not by forcing them into the same shape. 5 years after the ruling, Bellwether opened a school built from cooperative stone and brick. Its foundation plaque listed no benefactor. It recorded the number of households that supplied labor, bons, food, transport, olent. The curriculum included reading, arithmetic, geometry, and practical safety. Girls held survey chains as often as boys. Margaret taught one field class each week. She began with the difference between precision and truth. A measurement could be precise, yet attached to the wrong boundary. A document could be genuine yet insufficient to convey a shared right. A respected man could speak confidently and still depend on people being too frightened to check him. Students learned to test from independent points. The North Quarry never returned to the extraction levels Whitcomb demanded. Margaret's stability maps showed that aggressive cutting would endanger the village and exhaust the best stone within 15 years. The trust adopted a slower plan designed for 60. Lower output meant fewer sudden profits, but finished carving, bricks, and lime-supported stable work. The reserve parcel became common gardens rather than another pit. Dust collectors and wet cutting reduced lung illness, though they could not erase damage already suffered. The injury fund paid Mr. Shaw and other disabled workers a regular allowance defined as earned protection, not charity. Every March, the association inspected all 12 markers. Families walked the old bearings from Church Tower to Quarry Gate. The ceremony was not nostalgic. Boundaries shifted when nobody checked them. Children cleared moss from the iron doors and read each name aloud. At Lot 1, beneath Quarry House, Margaret always remembered the first plate appearing behind the loose stone. She had believed then that evidence would speak once uncovered. Experience taught her otherwise. Evidence required custody. Witnesses. Explanation. Courage. And a plan for what justice would do to people living inside the old wrong. The trust archive kept originals at Harbury Bank and certified copies in 3 locations. No single locked room, fire, employer, or frightened witness could erase the record again. The cooperative's 7th year brought the first death caused by work since the trust took control. A cart brake failed on the lower road, and a loaded wagon struck Samuel Frost, a careful driver with 20 years of experience. He died before the nurse arrived. The tragedy threatened Bellwether's belief that transparent rules could prevent the past from returning. Some committee members called it an unavoidable mechanical accident. Margaret refused the phrase until the facts were measured. Inspection showed that the brake pin had worn thin inside its housing. Invisible during ordinary surface checks, the maintenance schedule came from Whitcomb's old manuals and required disassembly only once each year. The cart had been inspected 7 months earlier. No worker broke a rule. Yet the system failed. Samuel's widow received the full injury benefit without surrendering her right to question the trust. The committee published the investigation, changed all cart inspections to 3-month intervals, and invited neighboring quarries to copy the finding. They placed no blame on a convenient dead driver. At the next marker walk, Samuel Frost's name was read after the original 9. Not because he owned their lot, but because the purpose of memory was to change future work. His widow later joined the safety committee and challenged Margaret more sharply than anyone. The trust's honesty did not remove her grief. It gave grief authority instead of treating it as an obstacle to business. That same year, the county proposed a reservoir whose planned access road crossed the common gardens. Officials argued that public need outweighed a few vegetable plots and offered compensation based on agricultural rent. Bellwether residents understood public need. Their own clean water depended on regional works. They objected to being treated as empty space once again. Ruth Hale's soil maps showed the garden supplied a significant portion of household food and contained drainage channels protecting lower cottages. Margaret surveyed an alternative route along waste ground. It cost slightly more but preserved gardens and improved access to the brickworks. Rather than reject the reservoir, the trust negotiated from evidence. The county adopted the alternative and paid for culverts. Bellwether's stand did not become selfish defense of every boundary. It demonstrated that public projects worked better when people living on maps could answer the people drawing them. Margaret's old employer's counting office became available after years standing vacant. Developers wanted to turn it into a private hotel, trading on the story of the lost workers' treasure. The trust purchased it for the archive and technical school. No treasure exhibition was created. One room displayed wage books, false deeds, marker rubbings, court maps, and the brass wedge left by the night intruders attacked Quarry House. Another showed current accounts and safety diagram. Visitors often found the second room less dramatic, but Margaret considered it more important. A community could remember a villain and still repeat his habits if present books remained closed. The school hired instructors beyond Margaret, including geologists, accountants, mechanics, and a solicitor who taught how to read leases. Tuition from commercial students helped fund places for workers' children. Graduates were not required to remain in Bellwether. Some left for railways, mines, and municipal offices. Their departure worried shareholders who believed training should repay the village. Margaret argued that education chained to one employer was merely a more polished company cottage. Graduates who stayed did so with choices. Those who left carried Bellwether's methods elsewhere and often returned plans, instruments, or apprenticeships. The village changed. New brick cottages replaced several damp stone rooms. But tenants participated in site selection. A public bath opened beside the clean spring, funded by lime sales. The chapel store became a maternity room twice a week. None of these services bore Margaret's name. She resisted portraits while alive and instructed the committee not to rename Quarry House after her. The fixed point belonged to the association before she arrived and should remain available after people forgot her. Thomas carved one private object for their cottage, a small limestone line exactly 6 feet long, set into the garden path. At one end he cut the word given, at the other, measured. Margaret said it was sentimental. She swept it clean every Sunday. When reporters asked what hidden fortune she found beneath the house, she sometimes led them to that line. Whitcomb had given her a legal description designed to make the property worthless. Measurement revealed that the description was false. The wealth came later from restoring rights, rebuilding work, and accepting limits. A marker could expose theft, but it could not operate a quarry, feed a family, settle a vote, or inspect a break. Those tasks made ownership real. 10 years after Margaret received the worthless house, a storm struck Bellwether. Rain loosened spoil above the north road, and a crack opened across a face scheduled for work the next morning. An apprentice named Lillian Price noticed that 2 survey pegs no longer aligned with the church tower. She stopped the shift before asking permission. The face collapsed at sunrise while the quarry stood empty. Not one worker died. Lillian expected praise for bravery. Margaret praised her observation and the rule that gave her authority to act. A system that depended on rare heroism, she said, had already failed. The association promoted Lillian to junior surveyor after examination. That afternoon, the school children gathered in Quarry House while rain beat against the repaired slate. The western wall did not move. Through small iron doors at its base, brass names caught the lamplight. Margaret opened her father's compass and placed it on the original plane table. Its needle settled north. Around her, students compared the old 12-lot plan with their own map of new cottages, gardens, drains, workshops, and safe quarry faces. The village no longer matched Whitcomb's deed or the association's first design. It had grown through decisions recorded by people entitled to make them. Margaret looked at the line where the wall once crossed 6 feet beyond a false boundary. 6 feet had seemed a small discrepancy, scarcely wider than a man lying down. Inside, it had weighted the difference between tenancy and ownership, accident and negligence, charity and wages, silence and a name cut into brass. Whitcomb tried to settle 12 years of labor with a ruin. The ruin gave Margaret no hidden gold and no effortless victory. It gave her a fixed point. From that point, she and Bellwether measured their way back to the truth.